One of my favorite artists is the 17th century Dutch painter Rembrandt, and over the span of his career, he created a number of masterpieces. Several of his masterpieces are depicted from various scenes from the Bible, and perhaps one of his most famous and my favorite is his depiction of the story of the prodigal son found in St. Luke's Gospel. But as equally stunning as that portrait of the prodigal son is the second one that has always spoken to me, and that is Rembrandt's depiction of the gospel that we have just heard proclaimed this evening, of the storm at the Sea of Galilee. This picture of Rembrandt hung for many years in a museum in Boston until it was stolen in a heist in 1990. And still to this day, it has never been found, sadly. But this picture that Rembrandt created gives a very vivid portrait of what would have happened that night with the apostles on the Sea of Galilee. You see them in a boat that is being battered by the high waters and the winds. The apostles are scattered throughout the boat, trying to save themselves and the boat. There is a look of terror on the faces of many of them, and two of them are gone to seek Jesus, who is sleeping, trying to awake him. But as you study the picture more and more, you would expect to find 13 persons in the boat, the 12 apostles and Jesus. But if you pay close attention to Rembrandt's depiction, there are in fact 14 people. And scholars say that the 14th person is Rembrandt himself. He inserted himself into the picture, not in an egotistical way, but more so scholars have said that he in fact was making a deep theological opinion, that in fact he being in the boat with Jesus represents all of us being in the boat with Jesus in the midst of the various storms of life. And Rembrandt came to recognize that with Jesus in the boat, even in the midst of the storms of life, all will be well. I think in many ways this depiction of Rembrandt, of this beautiful scene in our gospel tonight, helps us to be able to enter into the spirit of our liturgy and the readings that the church has provided for us. For in fact, all of our readings this evening remind us of that central principle that even in the midst of the storms of life, God is in the boat and God is in control. In our first reading this evening from the book of Job, we hear about that very familiar situation of Job being the very faithful and prudent servant of Yahweh God, who lived in right relationship with God, with others, and his true self. And yet, near the end of his life, he finds himself in the midst of the storm. And he wonders the question, why do bad things happen to good people? At this point in Job's life, he has lost all of his possessions. Many of his loved ones have died, and he in fact is inflicted with disease, pain, and misery. And in the midst of all of this, he begins questioning to God why all of this is happening to him, despite his faithfulness and steadfastness. But even in the midst of his questioning, he has a steadfast faith and trust in God. And this evening, our reading is God's response to Job in the midst of his questioning and wondering. And here Yahweh God reminds Job that even in the midst of the storms of life, that he is in control, that God is in control. And this realization allows Job to continue on in his steadfastness and faithfulness, even in the midst of the storms of life. In a similar way, this evening in our psalm, the psalmist shares with us about a group of sailors who were in the midst of the sea. And again, the elements of the sea took hold of them. But it was Yahweh God that reached out and saved the sailors in the midst of their storm. And why did God save them? as the psalmist reminds us that the steadfast love of the Lord is everlasting. And this psalm helps us then to be prepared for the great story that we hear in tonight's gospel from St. Mark of Jesus calming the Sea of Galilee. This experience of Jesus calming the Sea of Galilee must have been very significant for the apostles and the early church. For in fact, all four evangelists record this story in their own gospel. And it is a story that we are very familiar with. We know the basics. Jesus had been teaching and preaching all day to a large crowd. It was now turning to evening. He was tired, and he wanted to escape the crowd to go with the apostles to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They got into a boat, and they began sailing over to the other side. In the midst of it, as things were happening, Jesus falls asleep, exhausted from all that he had done that day. And as they were at the midway point of the sea, as so often happens, especially on the Sea of Galilee, suddenly, unexpectedly, a storm begins to brew. And all of a sudden, the apostles are filled with fear and terror. The waves are coming into the boat. The wind is fierce, and they believe that they are going to perish and drown. In the midst of them trying to save themselves at first, they recognize that their efforts are futile. And finally, in desperation, they decide to wake up Jesus. And as they wake him up, they address Jesus, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Notice that Jesus doesn't really answer their question. And instead, Jesus, with three simple words, calms the storm. "Peace, be still." All of a sudden, the waters are calm. The winds are calm. Everything is all right. The apostles know that they will now arrive at a place of safety, for Jesus has taken care of them in the midst of the storm. And as Jesus takes care of them, St. Mark tells us that they are now filled with a sense of great awe. They are beginning to recognize more and more who Jesus is. He is the one that can calm the storms of their life. And if they but turn to him and place their faith, their hope, their trust in him, all shall be well. And so Jesus, calming the storm in the Sea of Galilee, taught them to be able to surrender their hearts and their lives more and more day by day. This was the lesson that Job had to learn. This is the lesson that the sailors had to learn. This was the lesson the apostles had to learn. This is the lesson that Rembrandt had to learn. And it is also the lesson that we need to learn and relearn in the midst of our daily lives. For like Job, like the sailors, like the apostles, we recognize that oftentimes in the midst of our life journey, in the midst of our daily lives, we also have to navigate through the storm waters of life. And oftentimes at first, they can cause us great fear and trepidation. But like Rembrandt, we too need to remember that we are in the boat with Jesus and that God is in control. However, in the midst of the storms of life that we encounter, oftentimes believers, at least initially, can have a sense of naivete, thinking that as long as they believe in God, everything will go well and picture perfect in their lives. But the reality is, nothing could be further from the truth. Believing in God, being steadfast and faithful, does not exempt us from the trials, from the storms of life, as it didn't exempt Job or the sailors or the apostles. But as a friend of mine often says, God does not protect us from the storms of life, but God protects us in the storms of life. That God meets us in the midst of the stormy boat. That God meets us in the midst of the chaos, the brokenness, the confusion, the terror of our lives. And he gently but steadily brings us to that place of stability, to that place of safety, to that place of refuge. And so the good news of our God is that he is with us in the midst of the storms of our life, whether it is that we are dealing with our own sickness or mortality, or the mortality of our family and friends, whether it is the storms of life that we experience because of the fragility of broken relationships, or struggles in the midst of finances, or in terms of the bigger things that happen in the world. And we too, like Job and the apostles, can wonder, where is God in the midst of this? But ultimately, if we have the eyes and hearts of faith, we recognize that Jesus is right with us in the midst of the storm. He will guide us. He will comfort us. He will protect us. But we, like Job and the apostles, need to be able to cry out to him, to bring to him our fears, our insecurities, our needs. And yet, if we are honest with ourselves, oftentimes God is not the first that we turn to in the midst of storms of life, but the last. Oftentimes, when we are going through the midst of the storms of life, we tend to try to pretend that it is not there, distract ourselves. When that doesn't work, we try to numb the pain that is there by unhealthy patterns of behavior in our lives. When that doesn't work, we try to go looking for other solutions. And when everything seems to fail, when we hit rock bottom, sadly, that's when we turn to the Lord and think, maybe God can help me. But if we can be like the apostles and Job and turn to God not last, but first, to make known to him our needs, our fears, and to cry out to him, and then to have that same trust and faith as these apostles did, then we know that all shall be well, and God will take care of things and protect us in the midst of the storm. And why would God do this? Well, as both our psalmist and St. Paul in our second reading tonight remind us, the steadfast love of the Lord is everlasting. God in his love desires us not to perish, but to have life and life in abundance, even in the midst of the trials, even in the midst of the storms. And so let us become more and more like Rembrandt and recognize that we are not only in the storm and in the boat, but that Jesus is with us. And if we turn to him, all shall be well. And he will be our guide. He will be our protector. He will be our refuge. For the steadfast love of the Lord is everlasting.